So Penance is one of my favorite characters in Arknights, and I wanted to share some stuff with y'all about why I appreciate her and maybe help y'all see her character in a more full light. Give you some of the background information about her, the character influences, and all that jazz. So some of the preliminary notes, and these preliminary notes you can find on the Arknights wiki about her and all that stuff. But one of the first things to start off with Penance is the fact that a lot of her character is a pretty clear reference to Italian prosecutor Giovanni Falcone, who did a lot of work fighting the Sicilian mafia. Some of the key points that some of the key correlations between them are the fact that, first the name, Lavinia Falcone, that's Penance's full name, versus Giovanni Falcone, and then things like the fact that Il Siracusano, when Il Siracusano released on the English server, or on the global server of Arknights, it released on the anniversary of Giovanni Falcone's assassination. So there's some pretty clear connections there. Giovanni Falcone, again, was a prosecutor in a role very similar to Penance's, and worked quite zealously to defeat the mafia. Did important things like, or did interesting things in terms of legal strategy, like positioning his cases to make sure that when they went on appeal, that certain judges known to favor mafiosi on appeal wouldn't receive the cases on appeal. So funneling his cases towards certain judges who would be who were believed to be less corrupt, and were less likely to just give mafiosi free reign, so to speak. And he did all this against a backdrop of massive corruption related to the mafia in Italian government, and especially in when it came to the judicial system. And it's a problem that still exists to some degree today. And you can read up more on Giovanni Falcone if you'd like. His information's, of course, on the internet and whatnot. He's really cool, really fascinating person, and someone who deserves to be remembered, I'd say, for his work and for his example as a prosecutor. Moving on, this is a more legal fact, but something to note both about Falcone, about the Italian legal system, and especially about Penance, is the legal system in Penance's story is based off of that of Italy. And Italy has what is called a magisterial system or inquisitorial system. And what that means basically is that judges take an active role in prosecution and investigation that they don't in the United States or in other, especially English-speaking jurisdictions. The magisterial system is a fair bit more common in continental Europe. And basically the difference is just that judges take a very active role in prosecution, investigation, and all that, whereas here, judges take a very passive role. Judges are not involved in making prosecutorial decisions, generally speaking. They're generally not involved at all with the investigation, things like that. They have some judges have limited roles, but overall, judges have a very, very limited role, and the role of prosecutor and the role of judge are completely distinct in the criminal system of the United States and other common law countries like the United Kingdom, Australia, and so on, and other countries that follow our system as well. So the consequences is that the role of prosecutor and judge are fairly blurred. There's not nearly as clear a delineation, and it can vary, and it varies from one. Even within the magisterial system, whether they're the exact same role, or whether there's whether the prosecutor and the magistrate judge, whether they interact, to what degree they interact, and all that. But basically, the point is that if you're a judge in the magisterial system, you're basically a prosecutor as well, or at least you perform prosecutorial functions. So that's just some background information that is good for understanding her character, her influences, and whatnot. But moving on to why I like Penance so much is, and I just recommend y'all read through Illusido Kusano. It's very well written. I enjoy it a lot. It's a good story. And I won't dive into those details here to the story itself, but coming away from how Penance is portrayed in both Illusido Kusano and then in her general character writing and other things I'll mention later, is the story does a wonderful job of humanizing lawyers and judges in a way that I don't see with most stories. And in a non-dramatic fashion, just in a very humanistic, judges are people. Lawyers and judges are people, which that's an obviously true statement, but the significance of that is often not appreciated, and I just want to walk y'all through some of the reasons why. Because you probably know that lawyers are generally one of the least popular professions, to say the least, and they're generally a lot of people do not think very highly of attorneys. And some attorneys do earn that reputation, others don't, and a lot don't. A lot of attorneys do a very good job to be good people, and a lot of people go into the law because they want to help others. People don't tend to think of attorneys as the law as being a helping profession, but that's where a lot of its history is. And the current state of the law makes that a bit difficult for reasons I won't go into. But a lot of people do go into law with the desire to help people, to fight for justice, whether that's fighting for justice on the side of victims, as a prosecutor, or as a plaintiff's attorney, or whether that's in terms of defending, serving as a defense attorney, or whether that's criminal defense or civil defense, or in other functions such as transactional or compliance attorneys who can do a lot of good in helping companies actually obey the law, be conscientious of their duties towards the public, and towards business partners, things like that. And the best lawyers are genuinely the most conscientious ones. Contrary to what you see on TV, the boisterous, the aggressive attorneys are often quite unsuccessful because judges aren't impressed, for one, and many judges have a very strong sense of justice as well, and they don't like to watch attorneys bully people who aren't represented by attorneys or who are inadequately represented or things like that. And judges are very busy. They don't like shenanigans. So yeah. But anyway, but here's just some humanizing facts about some of the consequences of working in the law. And judges are, it's a really hard profession, and everyone practicing it is a very, very normal person. Like subject to mental illness, subject to stress, distress, exhaustion. And what we ask of lawyers and judges is genuinely incredible. So this is the way one of my torts professors put it, is that as an attorney, and this is also true of judges, your everyday is your client's worst day of their life. And you can just think about what you as a person with hobbies, with limitations, with confusion, with your own struggles and difficulties. You as a lawyer or as a judge are dealing with incredibly difficult issues and trying to make things as okay as possible in a very, very awful world. So just examples, if we're talking about criminal law or tort law, you're dealing with homicides, you're dealing with thefts, you're dealing with sexual assaults. You're dealing with all kinds of injuries and insults and people making each other miserable. Or sometimes it's on account of cruelty. Sometimes it's negligence, where something terrible happened despite the fact that nobody wanted it to happen. And everyone's, like in negligence cases, it's like everyone's distressed and like nobody wanted something terrible to happen, but something terrible happened anyway. And now it comes to an issue of how do we make things right, or as right as possible, despite when a freak accident happened, or a non-freak accident happened, if it's realistically speaking, if we're talking about negligence, where someone's arm got cut off, or someone is permanently blinded or permanently paralyzed. Or in the alternative, if you're on the defense side, it's like plaintiff might be lying or making things up or demanding too much, threatening of. It's like it's very easy for a defendant to end up being losing everything. Even if it's not criminal charges, it's like if you get a judgment against you for somebody's medical bills, like it's and you don't have like insurance to pay for it or something like that, that you could lose your home, you could lose, you could use your livelihood. It can be really nasty. Other issues, family law. If you're doing family law, your day to day is probably going to be mostly divorce. Working with people who are trying to divorce each other or fighting over, custody of the kids or just nasty stuff. Like very much the worst part about what's the worst part of everyone else's lives is your everyday, and that affects you. And knowing also that people are constantly lying to you as an attorney, you're constantly having to doubt the people you interact with, whether it's whether it's your own client or the opposing parties. And even when they're not lying, it's like you have to get around everyone's biases, and just learn to see around the story that everyone tells you. So it's really difficult to work in those conditions. No matter how well adjusted you are, no matter how intelligent you are, it's just a nasty, it's just a difficult field. Even safe areas, quote unquote safe areas to work, aren't actually safe if you understand the consequences. Like you could be a mergers and acquisitions attorney where your sole job is to help businesses combine. That's generally that would be one of the more safe areas where it's like, oh, you're just moving money around basically. But even working on large contracts or working on mergers and acquisitions, it's like, even though you're just moving numbers around and like merging businesses and things like that, your decisions have significant implications on people gaining or losing jobs. It has implications for fraud, breaches of contract, things like that. And you can be it's like it's like in law school, you get your wits scared out of you because your professors emphasize the fact that like it's really easy you don't want to be the attorney who lost your client $50 million or more. It's like $50 million isn't necessarily big anymore in the financial world. It's not big, to be frank. So it's like you don't want to be the attorney who like writes a clause wrong and loses your client a massive amount of money, which results in them firing 2,000 people, and things like that. And then you have other factors like the concern for, like if you go into the legal field for concern to justice, this is, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people go into the law because they want to seek justice. Well, there's a lot of obstacles to that, because there's a general trend to eliminate judicial and attorney discretion in many cases. And then there's like the whole phenomenon of law school, which can be law schools. A lot of legal culture and law school culture can be frankly abusive. I won't go into that right now, but as a survivor, so to speak, it's quite a lot. And then student debt forces most attorneys to go into high-paying jobs, not justice-oriented jobs, because justice-oriented jobs, most of them don't pay well. So yeah. And then just mistakes can be catastrophic. And then there's just the high standard of conduct that is required of attorneys. So, for example, just by way of example for that, Bill Clinton, he was allowed to serve after the Monica Lewinsky scandal, which is really tragic, especially, a lot of people had to reassess that after the Me Too movement. A lot of people who had been pro-Clinton before kind of reassessed that and was like, this is pretty scummy conduct. And it's unfortunate that there wasn't really that perspective at the time of the scandal. But Clinton was allowed to continue serving as president. He was not continued to allow serving as attorney. He actually lost his law license for what happened over the scandal. So it's interesting how Clinton was viewed as being ethically competent to serve as president, but not ethically competent to serve as an attorney. which is just an interesting factoid. It's like people pretend to think pretty poorly of lawyers, but lawyers are held to a higher standard than the president ever is. And just kind of wrapping up, all of this adds up to some pretty nasty consequences. So just some statistics. Lawyers and judges have 6 times the depression rate of the general population and 2 times the rate of suicidal ideation. That's really bad. Like, people in general aren't doing too great, I'd say. So for lawyers and judges to have 6 times the depression rate of people in general, and then a suicidality rate of double that of the general population, that's kind of the consequence of trying to handle all these cases. And like, no matter how hard you try to make things right, sometimes you're just going to make the wrong calls. No matter how wise you are as a judge, no matter how prudent you are as an attorney, you're just going to make the wrong call sometimes. And a lot of the times there's just going to be no good answer. Especially like if you've got a criminal defendant who's clearly guilty, there's some potential for them to change and repent, but there's very real injury. They've done things awfully. And you have to make the decision of whether to put them in jail or not. Or for how long or under what terms. And even though you want them to reform, you also don't want to re-release them into the public without reform, where they're going to just victimize someone else. Even something like fraud, it's like a lot of fraudsters are a lot of people are repeat offenders in general. So like, and then you have other issues where like death threats against judges and lawyers are on the rise in the U.S., which is a really alarming trend. But yeah, just overall, lots of stuff that judges are dealing with. And in the U.S., that's led to, in the legal profession, there's a really, really big problems, very high prevalence of things like alcoholism, workaholism, and just like social isolation. Law is a very demanding profession. You will lose out on social opportunities, etc. And this has just been a very long way. Like all of this, like obviously, like I haven't been talking about Penance for like the past 10 minutes or so, maybe more. But the thing is it's like Penance is a stress ball who is trying really hard to make things right and to seek justice. And that like made me feel more seen than like, I don't watch the crime drama. I don't watch the legal dramas or anything like that. They're a little bit silly for me. They don't make me feel seen, to say the least. But especially like there are some scenes where Penance just has to like turn down social offers, or just how she talks about the other students, like when she interacts with her former peers and talks about how some of her peers have been murdered, how some of them have lost their way, things like that. Those are all very real issues that people in the legal practice face. And it's tragic. And fortunately, like in the United States, corruption is relatively low, certainly lower than what's depicted in Il Siracusano. And you know, the murder of judges, and we do a good job at making sure, like protecting judges and lawyers from being murdered, but it's still a scary profession. And I recall when I was I met with a state DA, a district attorney, just when I was prepping for law school. And one of the things he asked me is whether, as I was contemplating entering the law profession, whether I was ready, like whether I had thought about the possibility of living with death threats by like organized crime, not like just like the death threats you get on the internet, but like death threats from mafia, from terrorists, from like from crazy adverse parties, whether it's or even in many cases your own clients, it's like a lot of people get threatened by their own clients, because a lot of people who end up in the legal system aren't necessarily, they're not necessarily in a good place, so to speak. And you as an attorney still believe they deserve proper representation, which can be a really difficult thing to navigate. Penance's first skin is, I remember when it came out, a lot of people were talking about it as if it were like some kind of like gap moe, or kind of just being out of character, because it's so unserious and so informal, and it's just Penance. But I just love it because it's just Penance being distinctly mortal, because that's exactly what judges are and lawyers are. They're so mortal, and they're dealing with they're carrying on their shoulders some of really what nobody else in our society is willing to deal with, and working hard to try to get good resolution of the hardest issues that our civilization produces, that our society produces, trying to deal with the worst relationships, trying to deal with the worst events, the worst accidents, the worst crimes, and trying to make things okay, even though they in many cases cannot be made okay. Moving back, so yeah, I just really appreciate Penance for being a person, and not just being the stoic, unfeeling object that most judges are in public depiction and in the public eye. I just appreciate her mortality. Yeah. And that's, if I had to do anything, that's the biggest takeaway. And we're already 21 minutes in, but I talk, and I'm going to continue talking, because I did want to track around to the thorns theme or the briars theme in Penance, this is really interesting. I don't necessarily have much to say on it, because I'm not entirely sure what the origin is. Why thorns are so heavily associated with the law in Il Siracusano and in Penance's story. Why are the codexes covered in thorns and things like that? Is there any inspiration or basis for that theming? I can't give an authoritative answer. The wiki suggests or claims that it is a reference to a book called The Bramble Bush by Carl Llewellyn, which is a very important book in American legal history. It's a book that founds it's one of the most influential works in a field called legal realism. Basically, it makes arguments to the effect of, it emphasizes, for instance, how a judge's decision can be affected by his mood, and it points to things like how judges may be harsher before or after lunch based on how hungry they are, things like that. I don't remember if all those claims are specific to the Bramble Bush or if those are just claims asserted in legal realism. It's been a while. But basically, the Bramble Bush seems to be one of the most plausible sources for the briar imagery in Penance's character. I'm not sold on the connection, but I think I think it makes a lot of sense. And maybe this will make it clearer. The book, The Bramble Bush, it's a metaphor. The name is a metaphor, and it's drawn from an old rhyme. And this is the rhyme. There was a man in our town, and he was wondrous wise. He jumped into a bramble bush and scratched out both his eyes. And when he saw his eyes were out with all his might and main, he jumped into another bush and scratched them in again. And it's a really funny rhyme, honestly. It's great. Hopefully that's worth waiting 24 minutes in to hear. I think it's a pretty great rhyme. But I also would say, actually, it's a very good metaphor for the law. Because the law trying to study the law like you would study a different discipline, you'll scratch your eyes out and scratch them in again. Because it's like you're not studying something real like physics or and you're not even studying something that is like emotive and like wonderful in the same way like literature is. Like law is constantly in constant flux. It deals with important concepts like justice, but everyone is always arguing about what justice is, and there's often no clear result, and it's just messy, and the goalposts are constantly shifting, and like it's not. It's like when you're studying medicine and like what the recommended treatment changes over time, it's the result of like a scientific process where like where people are observing things and trying to improve and enhance their understanding. Whereas when you're studying law and something changes over time over the course of your career, it's like it's not because like we've necessarily learned anything. It's like law can change because some congressman just had a stupid idea and convinced a majority in Congress that, hey, this stupid idea is great. So it's like with the law, you're studying like, you're not just studying man's wisdom and justice and like the goodness. You're studying the idiocy and like trying to combat and reconcile and turn into like get this absolute mishmash of laws made by both intelligent and very unintelligent people, trying to get something coherent out of it, which is frankly impossible. It's a bit of disaster if you have my opinion on it. I think we should shift our approach to law in a few ways. Again, out of the scope of this video, but yeah, the thorn. That's why the law is compared to a bramble bush, because you're jumping in and out, and there's a bunch of thorns, and it's a shifting target, and it's a mess and a disaster because you're not. It's like we wish life were the law, but it's often not. Or we wish that reason were the life of the law, and it is often not. That's the phrase. So yeah. Other possible, just as an alternative, there are like thorns and thorn symbolism. I do wonder whether there might be Italian sources or Chinese sources that might draw comparisons or use this kind of imagery. But the other main comparison I could think of is the Christian one, which relates the crown of thorns placed on Jesus to just rule and authority. And it points to like a lot of what I've mentioned earlier, which is just when you have the power of judgment, when you are responsible for judgment, it is a very cruel and dangerous thing, and it cuts into you, it tears into you, and you should never forget how grave the responsibility is. It should tear into your flesh, so to speak. I mentioned all the things about how like terrible it is to practice law, or like how hard it is, how you're dealing with really, really difficult issues. I'm more, in spite of all that, I want my judges and attorneys to be very conscious of that. The ones who are desensitized to that, who don't feel the weight of the lives that they hold in the balance, those are the scary ones. Those are the ones I don't trust. You should feel that crown of thorns. Or as in Penance's case, that gauntlet of thorns and the thorns around the codex of law. So just to wrap up, and we've already gone on quite longer than I'd hoped. I always ramble, but it's good. If something's worth saying, it's worth taking a long time to say it. That is true. And sorry for the phone pinging in the background. When you're doing a 28-minute continuous take, you're not going to stop for your phone. Anyway, so this is the last bit I want to talk about with Penance, and I think because I think it highlights something about her character, and this is an original hypothesis to me. This is something that I've perceived, correctly or not. But I do have a hypothesis about the process of her writing, which is that I believe that that Penance's character actually bifurcated during the writing process, and there's an early penance and there's a late penance. Early penance is what you get between her character song and her character lines. So like the voice lines, and then what you get when like what she says when you unlock the character. And then late penance is what you get in Il Siracusano. And I actually think late penance is much more interesting. And the reason why I think there's this bifurcation is because when you look at the song and when you look at Penance's character lines, most of them are expressing guilt about her own actions. and a sense of having failed to judge justly. That's kind of like the more or less the vibes I get from Penance's song and her character lines, her character profile. Whereas when you get into Il Siracusano, rather than her character focusing on or expressing guilt about her judgments, what the guilt that Penance feels isn't about what she has judged, it's guilt about what she has failed to do. Specifically, it's guilt over the times she wasn't able to, when her just shut up phone. It's guilt over. I want to make this distinction clear, but it's a bit difficult. But in Il Siracusano, she's frustrated by her inability to achieve justice not because of her own decisions, but because of the decisions of others in the system. For instance, it mentions in one example where she has issued, I think it was a guilty verdict on a case, or she was handling a case, and then another judge transferred the case away from her file, away from her caseload, and resolved the case on his own in favor of a mafiosi, or mafioso. I don't know Italian, but basically having decisions taken away from her, and then not being able to exercise justice in those cases, and then also she in Il Siracusano, she also expresses significant guilt over the fact, or distress might be more correct for this one. She expresses significant distress over the fact that her ability to exercise just judgments is reliant on the fact that she has the backing of a Don. That if she didn't have the protection of a Don, she wouldn't be able to issue any just judgments. But the point is that the judgments she actually issues are just, but she isn't allowed to do it as much as she wants to and knows the people of Siracusa deserve. She wishes she could be more just, and that she didn't have these cases that were taken away from her, where her work was frustrated, or and she wished she could. She didn't have to rely on protection of the very people she opposes, namely a Don, and that Don's mafia organization. So that's very different from feeling guilt about not issuing unjust decisions due to mafia pressure or corruption. Very different. And it makes sense to me why this character bifurcation would occur, because and it's the reason why I refer to the Penance depicted in Il Siracusano as being later Penance, because when you're creating a character for Arknights, this is what I assume their character creation pipeline looks like. You're going to create the character profile and commission the song and things like that. You're going to do that based off of the character's concept, the character's raw prompt. And you need to do that early in the process because you need to pay voice actors and get that through quality assurance and things like that. So you need to do that a lot earlier than when you're going to write out the full character and for the full character story. Because the Penance in the song and the characters, as I mentioned, is concerned about very different things. And it makes sense that the longer process, the longer time that the writers are going to have writing out Il Siracusano is going to give them more time to flesh out their character and decide who they want Penance to be. Because the Penance of the song and the character lines is, frankly, a fairly common, like the corrupt judge, or the judge who's like a penitent. You can even get it in the name, penitent. The judge who's penitent about their own judgments, who's judged unjustly. That's a fairly common character, whereas the Penance that we get in Il Siracusano is more subtle, much more interesting, and at least in my humble opinion, and is the character who I relate to. But yeah, it makes sense to me just that they would have started out with this raw concept. We want this judge who's penitent, who's experiencing penance. That's her core concept. And we're going to pay someone to write a song and pay you to sing it, and we're gonna write down the dialogue, and we're gonna pay you to voice the character. And Penance is voiced in several languages, including Italian, so that's going to take a little bit of extra time, possibly. It's just more. It's going to be work, and then when we actually sit down to write her story in Il Studio Cusano, we have more time to do that. We don't have to pay anyone to do voice work afterward, and just as we're going through that process, we start with that character, this penitent judge, but the reasons why she's experiencing grief and regret change, and they become this more nuanced thing, where it's like the concept of the character is still roughly the same, but the motivations and the concerns and the emotions she's feeling are just totally different, even though on the surface they look quite similar. And that's just my hypothesis about how that her character changed over time. And you really get these very two different characters in the result. And I really love Penance of Il Studio Cusano, whereas I wouldn't love her as much if she were just the judge depicted by her song and character lines and her character profile. So yeah, that's the stuff I wanted to talk about. I love Penance, obviously. I don't talk about most characters for 36 minutes. Hope y'all learned a few things along the way. We had some good discussions about like Giovanni Falcone, who I very much look up to. I think is a really worthwhile person to study and learn about yourself. Talked about the magisterial system, the importance of humanizing lawyers and judges, and just the fact that it's really crazy what we ask judges and lawyers to deal with, and how very little support they often have in dealing with those things. We talked about the thorn themes and the bramble bush by Carl Llewellyn. That's a whole different rabbit hole you could jump down into if you want to really understand a bit about legal philosophy. I mean, whether it counts as legal philosophy, it is legal philosophy. There's just some technical discussions on that front as well. And then finally, the character bifurcation. And throughout that, there was also my phone ringing and things like that. And apologize for the noise, but, it's been 30... It's like, I know things are a bit scuffed, but I'd rather do things scuffed than not do them at all. And scuffed is the only way I'm doing them right now. I've got a lot of stuff going on, but I love Penance, and I wanted to do this video. And especially since we just got through the Il Studio Cusano rerun, I wanted to talk about her before... we don't know if we're going to get another story for her, but... I just love this character, and I wanted to discuss some of those reasons and discuss, other important things about like the things I've discussed, things about like the character of our law, the experiences of people who practice law, things like those are all important things that it's good for people to know about too. So I hope this has been worth your time. And even if I'm not the most efficient speaker on YouTube, but I try to say things that are worth hearing, even if it takes me a while to say. So take care. Thanks for being here, and see y'all on the flip side. Au revoir.